Hi everyone and welcome to Tales of Dread. In this episode, we talk about strange stories from the highway. As a light rain started to fall, Stefan Pinkridge cursed his father. Knowing how he looks, it would soon start to rain, and when he got home, he would look like a rat that got caught in the rain. It was a little after 8 p.m. with each passing day. The nights of autumn came earlier and earlier, and the sun had already set in the west. The afterglow gave the night sky a blue tint, but it turned completely black above. Just enough light was left for him to see that his friend Paul Patton lived in a big country house just over a mile away. He had been there since late afternoon. He usually rode his bike, but 2 days before, he rode into a ditch and bent the front wheel. He had to walk to his friend's house because of this. His mom had promised to pick him up in the evening so he wouldn't have to walk home in the dark, but his father had to work late and the family's only car was not available, putting him in this trouble. Stefan didn't mind walking. He didn't like that winter was coming, that the British weather was unpredictable, and that it was getting darker. He lived in the small town of Newport in the English county of Shropshire. It wasn't a bad neighborhood by any means, but there was a feeling of dread on the country roads at night. This was due in part to the many myths and legends that grew up around him when he was 15 years old and still haunted him. On this night, he was walking along Chester Road and had just turned a corner away from St. Michael's Church and toward his home on the edge of town. On his right was a high brick wall built on top of a sloped embankment that ran almost the whole length of the highway. The night was quiet. Along this stretch of road, there were neither homes nor streets, just fields and trees. As he walked along the path, he hadn't seen any other people walking and no cars had passed him. Up ahead, about 50 feet away, a vague movement on top of the wall caught his eye. It was dark, so it was hard for him to see what it was. He could only see a white smudge. At first, he thought it was a cat, but it turned out to be a shopping bag that had gotten caught in the old brickwork. But as he got closer, this shape seemed to get bigger, as if someone had been sitting on the wall and stood up when he got closer. As he got closer, he could make out the clear shape of a person. When he was 15 feet away, he stopped walking. He suddenly realized that the figure was actually a dull, white, transparent ghost with no features that was just standing there and looking at him, from the top of the wall. As his mind began to figure out what he was seeing, a chill went through his whole body. Since he was a child, he had heard stories about a ghost who was said to haunt this stretch of road. In the 17th century, a woman from Chetwynd Park, a manor house up the road, was said to have died during childbirth and lost her baby. Her name was Madam Piggott, and her ghost was said to jump out in front of cars and sit next to the driver and passenger seats, among other scary things. Stefan had always thought these stories were nonsense, but when he came to, he saw something he couldn't explain. He thought about running back the way he came, but that would have taken him another 2 miles. Instead, he leaned forward and decided to go much faster, passing the ghostly figure as it continued to look down at him. He looked back at it several times as he ran away, but it just stood there without moving. As he got farther away, he started to feel a little better. When he was about 50 or 60 feet away, his fear turned into curiosity. He decided to stop and look back at the still ghost. After a moment of studying it, he took a small step back in its direction. Suddenly, the ghost jumped down from the wall and started running toward him. Stefan turned around and ran as fast as he could back to his house. Every time he looked behind him, the figure was still there and seemed to be getting closer. He didn't have time to think about whether this ghost or creature or whatever it was chasing him or just running toward him. Luckily for him, he didn't stop to find out. He ran cross-country for his school, and even though he was only a half mile from home, he ran faster than he ever had before. When he turned left into his street at the end of Chester Road and ran into his front yard, his house was the first one on the corner. He banged hard on the front door. It seemed like forever before his mother answered. When she did, he was out of breath and pointing to the main road next to their street. Both of them stood there and watched as this strange person ran past their house and toward Chetwynd End. One of my best friends told the story you just heard to the person who runs this channel. Back in the 1980s, this is said to have happened to his uncle. And I can say for sure that other friends, family members, and acquaintances have told me similar stories about Chester Road. No one knows if it has to do with the ghost of Madame Pigot or something else, but it is a well-known local story. The next story, though, comes from a reader who goes by the handle Adona Mariposa Jealous. We were never told the witness's real name, so we will just call her Donna. In September 2009, Donna was driving east on Highway 70 toward Ruidoso, New Mexico, late at night. Her 3 dogs were in the car with her, but they didn't like each other. So, they all had to sit in different places. One was in the back, one was in the front passenger seat, and the smallest one was in her lap as she drove around a mountain with a big white cross on top. Her car suddenly jerked and veered to one side, as if one of the tires had blown, and she pulled over to the side of the road. She got out to check on her car, but she couldn't find anything wrong with it. There were no dents or scratches, and all 4 tires were still in good shape. Confused? She was getting back into her car when she looked up at the cross on top of the mountain. It was strangely lit up by the moonlight, and even though she passed it a couple of times a week, she felt like she was just noticing it for the first time. When she got back into her car, she was surprised to see that all 3 of her dogs were now sitting together on the front passenger seats, each with their hair standing on end. She found this strange because her dogs usually couldn't stand to be near each other. However, something had brought them together in this way. Unnerved, Donna tried to wash her Doberman so that she could put him back on the back seat. Even though there was nothing in the back of the car, the dog wouldn't move. When she finally came to terms with it, she started the car and kept going. After just a few seconds of getting back on the highway, she saw that her radio had stopped working. No matter how she changed the frequency, all she heard was nothing. Still, the dogs were growling, and she started to feel more and more sure that someone else was in the car. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. Then, out of nowhere, she felt pain and heard slow, ragged breathing coming from behind her. Donna looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the back window was beginning to fog up. This made the dogs start to whine. Even though it was a dry September night, all the hairs on her body stood up, and she started to panic. She didn't know if she should pull over or just keep driving, and she prayed to God that the strange thing would go away soon. She chose the second option, and she drove more than 20 miles with what seemed to be a ghost hitchhiker before it left her car at the edge of the Mescalero reservation. It seemed like the air pressure in the car changed, as if a window had been opened. During her ordeal, she hadn't even noticed how stifling the air had become. Suddenly, the radio started up again, and her dogs sat back down in their usual spots. Donna doesn't know any local legends about US Highway 70, but she does know that the cross on top of Round Mountain remembers a group of Apache warriors who attacked Tularosa and were trapped and killed there. On the other side of the world, could her ghostly hitchhiker have been the ghost of someone who died in this battle? There is a well-known story from Indonesia that one traveler would find to be all too true. In 2004, Chandra Widodo was traveling between Jambi and Palembang on the island of Sumatra when he saw what he thought was the Kuntilanak. The country is said to be a vampire woman, who usually attacks young women, but has been known to attack men as well. In March of that year, He was driving late at night on a rural stretch of highway when he saw a woman in the road waving him down. He thought she might be in trouble and slowed down. He began to slow down and stopped his car right next to her. In the light of the full moon, he could see a pale but beautiful woman standing on the side of the road. He lowered his window to get a better look. He asked her if there was a problem, but she didn't answer. Instead, she just stood there with a strange smile on her face. This made Chandra a little nervous, and as he asked her again, he saw that her face was starting to change. He was shocked to see her change from a beautiful young woman into an old, haggard creature with bulging white eyes and a mouth full of demonic teeth. Chandra slammed on the gas to get away from the strange woman, but almost immediately the headlights started to flicker and the engine spluttered and almost died. The car started to move, but it seemed like it had very little power, as if it was starting in a higher gear. When he was about 20 feet away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the woman was still waving at him. Her arm seemed to move slowly above her head. Suddenly, he heard a loud rumbling sound, and the car started to shake and vibrate. Chandra later said it felt like he was in an earthquake, but as he moved away from the strange woman, the rumbling stopped, and the car started to move faster. Chandra thinks about this experience every night before he goes to sleep. He says he will never forget how her face changed in front of his eyes or the last time he saw her waving goodbye in the rearview mirror as he drove away. He is still sure that the thing he saw that night was the Coon Tillanak. Our last story comes from Emily Dented in the Australian state of New South Wales. Emily and her boyfriend Louis were going on a 2-week vacation from Melbourne to Broome in 2014. This trip takes almost 2,500 miles and 43 hours by car. Most of it goes through the Australian outback. With stops in Port Augusta, Alice Springs and Halls Creek, it would take 4 days to get there. On the second day of the trip, Emily and Louis took turns driving for 5 or 6 hours while the other rested. Before they got to Alice Springs, the couple was on the Stuart Highway. Emily woke up to the sound of her boyfriend crying to himself in the driver's seat. He had his hands on the wheel and his head was resting on it. The clock in the car said that it was 11:14 p.m. She looked around and saw that they were in the middle of nowhere, while the engine was still on. When Emily asked him what was going on, Louis was surprised to hear her voice. "A deer?" He told her it was a deer. "I think it was confused." She asked him to explain, but he was so upset that he couldn't calm down and just kept repeating himself. She decided that he wasn't in a good enough mood to keep going on the trip. She drove about 40 miles more to get to Alice Springs. As time went on, Louis seemed to calm down. When they got to the hotel, Emily asked him again reluctantly what had happened. He told her that he had seen something in the road. He said that the high beams had lit up a movement in the dark from about 100 feet away, which he thought was a person walking along the highway as they got closer. He could tell that this person was very skinny and walked in an odd way. But as soon as he looked at the face, he knew it wasn't a person. It had a long nose and held its arms, or paws, out in front of it as it walked along the road. But it was the eyes that had scared him so much that he died. They were deep, black, soulless orbs that stared at him as they drove by. They seemed to look into his soul and fill him with fear. He said it again, it was a deer. He went on to say that deer sometimes stand on their haunches and walk on their back legs. But Emily could tell from the way he said it that he was trying to convince himself more than her. He knew that deer never came this far into the outback, so he was trying to convince himself. She went on to say that Louis had never been the same after that. After this happened, he couldn't sleep and fell into a deep depression. Unfortunately, he would end up killing himself.